On the line right now, I have someone who we've been after for a while. He has a blog out called John Q. Public. His name is Tony Carr. Tony Carr is a retired Air Force officer, student at Harvard Law School, senior editor of the Harvard National Security Journal, and the creator and executive editor of John Q. Public, a military blog and online community focused on the Air Force. Tony enlisted in the Air Force at the age of 17 and spent a total of 23 years on active duty as a C-17 pilot, weapons and tactics officer, squadron commander, senior advisor, fighter aircraft mechanic, and military strategist. He served extensively in Iraq and in Afghanistan, earning a distinguished Flying Cross and racking up more than 400 hours in combat. Before retiring in 2013, Tony's last position was commander of the 14th Airlift Squadron, which broke several combat records and delivered 1/5 of all airdrop material in Afghanistan in 2011 under his leadership. It is my pleasure to introduce to the circus Mr. Tony Carr. Tony, welcome to 104.1 KQTH.
Hey, James. Thanks for having me. Good to hear from you.
It is great to hear from you, and you have been on the forefront of just bringing awareness to the Air Force and their interest in divesting of the A-10. This is one of the reasons I wanted to have you on. But Lieutenant Colonel, let's cut right to the chase. Can you tell us why you left the United States Air Force, why your site exists, John Q. Public, and what you're trying to do with it?
Hey, I appreciate that. I appreciate the question. I appreciate you having me on. Let me help get the word out about the A-10 and about other things. I had a great story in the Air Force. I love the Air Force. I fell in love with it at an early age, like you said, 17 years old, served in it for a long time, saw a lot of changes. When I got my crack at command, it looked to me like the Air Force was breaking or maybe even already broken. And it just looked to me like it was going to take a decade or maybe 2 decades before I'd be in a position where I would have anything to say about that, because it's not just that there are problems in the institution, it's that it's kind of lost the ability, I believe it's lost the ability to listen to its own people and hear the solutions that they have. They're the ones with the solutions. I didn't think it could fix itself internally, and I didn't think it was fair to ask my family to go through the sacrifice of trying to, of hoping for that. So I got out to provide that external voice. I didn't know how I would do it, and the path has kind of illuminated itself along the way. So the reason I started the site is to kind of give people a place, to a touchstone, to collect and kind of have the reasonable disagreement that I think any good process needs that couldn't happen inside the Air Force. It has kind of evolved. So, nowadays we call attention to things we see in the Air Force, problems, issues, sometimes really good news stories within the service. And, we invite airmen and the public and Congress to digest and debate these things. It's become a little bit more. It's become a place where we sometimes advocate. If we think someone has not been, fairly treated by the Air Force or its processes, we do a little advocacy, a little investigation, and sometimes we do public accountability, like we did with the James Post situation. So my goal is that we get a site together that helps the senior officials see maybe what they're missing. Put folks inside and outside the Air Force to get an appreciation for the problems that airmen are facing as they try to go about defending the country, and become a resource for ideas on how to reform the Air Force, which I think is necessary. You've got a heck of a fighting team of people out there working hard to give this country a good defense, and I think the institution needs to do a better job of indicating all that they're giving.
Well, it's a bold move for you to leave the Air Force because you thought that you could probably be more effective from the outside, and you're focused on reforming it. What are the dangers? Because you mentioned Post, and we're going to get to him in a moment. But I think the atmosphere that gave us this incident and others that we're looking at right now created just an environment of hostility. Or is that fair? What are the dangers of the United States not reforming what you saw as a real problem?
I'm a believer in air power. I believe air power is important for our country. It's an asymmetry that we have. It's something we do that other countries can't, other nations, other potential adversaries can't do, or at least can never do at the level of skill and expertise that we do it. We have to guard that. We absolutely have to guard that. So if we don't reform the Air Force, a couple different things could happen. The one thing that could happen is that Congress could get tired of hearing about problems within the Air Force Congress could start looking for ways to save money and could start hearing those voices from people who say that we should, abolish independent air power, take it apart, fold it back into other services or something like that. I think that would be a grave error for this country. I think air power, is only great, or the seed of its greatness is the freedom to be intellectually innovative and to think about how to apply it. And putting it back in another department would be a big mistake. But that could happen if we're not careful. The other, maybe more grave thing that could happen is that we could get caught flat-footed. I mean, think about the ICBM scandal that happened in the Air Force last year for your listeners that might have been familiar with that. We have, had an entire community that was rotting from the inside culturally and ethically, and it didn't get noticed. And, if that's happening in other communities, it's only a matter of time before an adversary catches us flat-footed, not ready to do the job we need to do. So without reform, I think we risk those things, and that's why I'm committed to keeping after it.
We're speaking with Tony Carr, retired Lieutenant Colonel Tony Carr. He's also has the blog John Q. Public. You have a really worldwide following, don't you, on John Q. Public?
It's getting bigger, yeah. I mean, I think we started with people who maybe knew me a little bit or had grown up in the Air Force around the same time that I did and understood the themes that I was reinforcing. And since then, I think we've kind of tapped into something that I didn't realize was there, and that's a pretty widespread concern about not just I think it's my folks that frequent my site are focused more about the Air Force and about air power. Mm-hmm. But I think they're reflecting what's going on across the DoD and maybe even across our federal agencies. Is that there's a kind of a broad concern about the need for reform, and I think we've tapped into that.
My audience is very familiar with General James Post. At the Arizona Daily Independent picked up on some comments that you made on your page, and the whole idea that to talk to senators, to talk to our representatives about the A-10 could be seen as treason by the Air Force really chilled a lot of people, you included, and you felt obligated to expose General James Post's comments. What does his conduct mean for the Air Force, and what questions does his firing raise?
It's very concerning. His conduct, not long after I heard about his comments and got them out there, I wrote a piece where I likened what was going on inside the Air Force, exemplified by his remarks, as something that's maybe an ugly cousin of fascism, something that looks a little bit like fascism, where we cave more to power than we do to reason, where we stop worrying about the right process and just start listening to whoever's in charge. That's not the way for a responsible public agency to conduct itself. So I wrote about that, and I thought that his conduct fit within that pattern. It's sort of an institutional decay pattern. It's really a response to external pressure and an inappropriate response. I think the Air Force has given into those pressures by micromanaging itself. I think a lot of commanders, if you talk to them, would tell you that the collaborative culture that the Air Force needs has been shut down. Authority has been pulled away from people on the front line. NCOs and officers has been concentrated at the top. What I saw is, if a two-star sitting in the vice position of the Air Force's biggest warfighting command, 2 rungs below the chief of staff, if he thinks that kind of talk is okay, that's a red flag. It raises questions about whether he was doing what he thought his boss wanted, whether generals understand the rights of the people, of their own people, and by extension the people that they're supposed to be defending, whether General Welsh and senior leaders of the Air Force have created a kind of climate where, with their own remarks, where this stuff is acceptable. I mean, as you know, General Welsh has labeled the A-10 advocates emotional
yes.
for quite a while now. And that gets under a lot of people's skin. But I have to ask the question of myself, is a guy like James Post just kind of barking at the dog whistle when he makes those comments? That's something that I think the Air Force has to confront.
Well, as they go higher up the chain, I mean, I don't General Post. We have another situation here with the base commanding Meager with some files I want to talk to you about in a moment. But it seems like for those who say, these guys are just following orders, how much of that is true, and how much of it? I mean, if you don't follow orders, if you know the people in charge want things a certain way, and you don't do that, aren't you putting your career in jeopardy? How much of this is just following orders, and at what point in time do you have to really break away and get more in tune with what the real issue is?
These officers all have an ethical duty. So as individuals, they can't be vindicated by the idea that there's a system that demands them to do things or demands them to warp their behavior to a certain outcome. They won't vindicate them individually, so they're still culpable, just like Post is still culpable for what he said and the effect that he created. But that does not also, their individual culpability doesn't spare the Air Force. If the Air Force is creating a system or a culture or a climate that it knows is leading to these kinds of unethical outcomes or to people being emboldened to say and do things they shouldn't do, misconduct, then the Air Force has to take a good look at itself. And I think both things are necessary.
Actually, Post comments really motivated Senator Ayotte and Senator McCain to take action. But it seems like in your readings and following the Arizona Daily Independent that Post is just not even the tip of the iceberg, that this really is a culture. What should Congress do about the situation?
There's a couple things I think Congress should do. I think number one, and I just want to get this, I'm writing a piece that'll say this, but I want to get this out there now. I think Congress, for this budget cycle, should just put the A-10 aside. We now know that Post made these comments. We don't know what effect it had. It may have chilled people from participating. We don't think we had a clean political process. And so the A-10 should not be touched this time around, at least, until we know we've had a clean political process. It shouldn't be considered. But I think the question you're asking is the deeper question. I think that Congress needs to take a closer look at the overall climate of the Air Force's Senior Officer Corps. Now, there's a number of ways that Congress could do that, but I think it should be Congress. I don't think the Air Force should do this internally. From what people tell me, just like you've heard, Post wasn't necessarily the exception. He's closer to what's become maybe a little bit too normal. We know from the IG inquiry that General Welsh knew that Post said the word treason all the way back on January 13th, but he didn't start an investigation. He didn't remove him from his job. It was only when Senator McCain pushed the service and Senator Ayotte publicly pushed the service that there was a response. We've seen the service misleading the public on the A-10 debate. Like you talked about earlier, we had an officer scrubbing a key slide.
Actually, I want to hold you right there, Tony, because I want you to get into that for a moment. We're talking to Tony Carr. He is a retired Air Force officer, retired lieutenant colonel, and what we want to do is give him some time to get into what was happening with the whole Meager case, the scrubbing of the slides, and other A-10 issues. His blog is John Q. Public. I encourage you to check it out. It is fantastic, and we have more with him on the other side. You are listening to 104.1 KQTH. You are listening to 104.1 KQTH. We have Tony Carr on the line. Tony Carr was a retired Air Force officer, student at Harvard Law School, senior editor of the Harvard National Security Journal, and creator and executive editor of John Q. Public, a military blog, online community focused on the Air Force. Sir, welcome back to the circus.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
This situation with Meager, who the base commander here, the scrubbed slides, Arizona Daily Independent reported on this story as well. And, I got to tell you, we got some blowback because along with General Post, General James Post and Meager, they're saying that these are really, really good guys. And I don't doubt that. I don't know the gentleman, but the actions from the treason to the scrub slides, and happen to be the slides that talk about the mission the A-10 does with Cass and the gap that would exist if you were to get rid of the A-10, that's serious business, is it not?
Yeah, it is. I mean, we should draw something from the fact that you get a little bit of pushback, especially with Colonel Meager. I've never heard a bad thing about Colonel Meager. I have no problem believing that he's a superb officer and a superb leader, and generally speaking, has earned that following that he has. But hey, man, when we're having something called a Close Air Support Summit, and the idea is to speak some truth to the Air Force's headquarters so that it can advise Congress on the right way to spend defense dollars that are scarce. We can't be omitting key truths from that slide presentation. Now, I have no doubt. I know there have been some mixed reports on this, but I have no doubt that he did not just make this briefing and give it to General Welsh. There were some people in between. I think ADI reported that maybe General Walters was involved in one of the reviews of this slide package. I'm sure that he got some quote unquote suggestions about what he should do with those slides. And I think if we ever, get to the point of knowing all those facts, that'd be a good, interesting story about how he came to the decision. But, that slide needed to be in there, and if for no other reason than to make General Welsh responsible for having heard that information.
I agree, and it's always we're a small community here, and we don't like to see people get burned, especially good people. But when we're talking about what the mission is, close air support, and just it seems in my mind the maniacal mission to destroy it on behalf of the Air Force. It's just I know that the A-10 has always been a platform that the Air Force has not been happy with, but they seem bound and determined by any means necessary to divest this as soon as possible. What do you think is the impetus behind that?
I think it's a response to pressure. Responses to pressure. It's funny because pilots, especially Air Force pilots, are trained to respond appropriately to pressure. That's the whole name of the game. But as an institution, we don't always do that. We sometimes respond inappropriately. So what I think is going on is the Air Force is reading the tea leaves, just like all the services, realizing that defense spending is coming down against national level entitlements that don't seem to be able to come down, and they're trying to find a way to do less. So they're trying to find areas where they can get rid of force structure and get rid of mission and save big dollars so they can fold those dollars into the things they do. And it's a meritable goal to want to do the things you do well. I think the problem I won't say this. I think the problem I have is we can't do that with we have to do that explicitly. We can't do that with an opaque process. If the Air Force wants out of the close air support business, the way we define close air support, it's not allowed to redefine it. It's not allowed to, use these kinds of tactics to get rid of it. It has to sit down with national level leaders, speak truth to power, and say, we can't do this anymore unless you give us enough resources. That's the right way to get out of it.
We're speaking to Lieutenant Colonel Tony Carr. I want to hold you over because I want to give you an opportunity to talk about the A-10 specifically in its mission, because you were a C-17 pilot, sir. And again, I read your resume earlier. I'm going to do it again because it is quite impressive. But your passion for defending the A-10 and the job that it is doing, I want to give you the opportunity to talk about that with my audience as well. We have Lieutenant Colonel Tony Carr on the line. He is a retired Air Force officer. He's a student out at Harvard University. He has a blog, John Q. Public, that is very well known within the Air Force community and is starting to go beyond that as more people are checking into his blog, as he is one of the ones that are on the forefront of defending the A-10 right along with ADI and yours truly. We will be revisiting. We'll bring Mr. Carr back on the other side. Also, I want to remind you that in the 4 o'clock hour, we're going to touch base with Captain Arizona Adam Quasman on the latest candidate to declare him wanting to be president, Marco Rubio. You're listening to 104.1 KQTH. You are listening to 104.1 KQTH, Tucson's News and Talk. We are on the line with Tony Carr. He's a retired Air Force officer. He is also has a blog called John Q. Public that is very popular within the Air Force community. Tony enlisted in the Air Force at the age of 17, spent a total of 23 years on active duty as a C-17 pilot, weapons and tactical officer, squadron commander, senior advisor, fighter aircraft mechanic, military strategist. He served extensively in Iraq and Afghanistan, earning a distinguished flying cross and racking up more than 400 hours in combat. He got out of the United States Air Force to be an advocate of change. He figured that he could do more to help the Air Force change its culture from the outside than the inside. We have him on the line right now. Tony, welcome back to the circus.
Hey, good to be back, James.
You flew the C-17, and yet you are a big supporter of the A-10. Why is that?
The two platforms have a lot in common in that they work closely with our ground-based joint partners. That's not the reason. This is usually the part where the pilot will lie to you and say, "Gee, I could have flown anything, but I chose to fly the C-17." The truth is, I would love to have flown the A-10. I came up just a little short of the ability to choose an A-10. I ended up in the C-17. But the biggest thing that has always struck me about the A-10 is that it says something about the Air Force, about us as a service, about what we're committed to do. As long as we have an A-10 or a follow-on that is similarly committed or similarly capable, we have a standing commitment to a community that does nothing other than think about how to protect folks on the ground and how to help them in their fight.
Mm-hmm.
Close air support is an enduring mission. It is something we will always have to do because we will never win a war over the vital interests of this country without engaging enemy combatants on the ground. We always will have to do close air support. So we need an aircraft that is committed to that. If we don't have the A-10, it becomes very easy for the Air Force to not stay totally committed to that mission or to start to fraction it out and put it into other communities that are focused on other things.
Well, some have suggested that the A-10, the wing, be given to the Army or to the Marine Corps instead of it being with the Air Force.
I have a little bit of a visceral reaction to that. People say that a lot of times on my blog or on my page, and sometimes I smack them down because this is air power. This is what air power is about. This is a core air power function. This is something the Air Force does. This is an airplane that doesn't just do CAS. It also does. It also escorts and commands rescue operations. It also shoots tanks. It's an air power platform and it's an air power mission to do close air support. I think there's a danger in folding a core air power mission into a ground service because that service's focus and their perspective is on a 3-meter target, is on a close fight, and they're not going to have the intellectual capacity to also think about how to best exploit air power. So we got to keep it and we got to do it. That's the charge of the Air Force.
That's the best response I've ever seen to that question, that observation. Plus, as much as our troops love seeing that overhead protecting them, I'm told that our enemies fear it just as much.
Absolutely. I've said it a couple times, and I say this half in jest, and it's a little mean-spirited, but I hate the fact that the Air Force and our adversaries are together in wanting to get rid of the A-10. To me, a great way to sort of logic check your strategy is to ask what your enemy would think about what you're trying to do. If your enemy would agree with it, you have a reason to take a good long pause and think about if what you're doing is really in the national interest.
Can you, this is my final question for you, Tony, and I thank you for joining us today. Can you give your assessment of the Air Force's budget dilemma and how you think General Welsh should respond to all of the mounting pressure that you talked about earlier?
There's no doubt Congress has given the Air Force and all the services too much to do and not enough resources to do it. But at the same time, all of the services, and certainly the Air Force, have things that they could be doing smarter. They could be doing better. There's a lot of waste in the DoD. I could rattle off 10 examples for you within the Air Force of things that need to be ended or need to be made more efficient. So, while the Air Force has a point about big picture resources, they have not responded appropriately to the budget pressure that is upon them. They've got to do better. I think that everybody kind of felt like sequestration would blow over, budget caps would blow over, and when they didn't, you kind of see people standing around now out of options for how to respond. General Welsh, who I think a lot of as a leader, I think maybe that's the answer. He's not asking me, at least not right now, but if I were to give him advice, I would say, when the bureaucratic problems become too intractable, just go back to basic leadership. And that's how he got his job in the first place. I think he's got to get the trust back from his airmen, certainly from his squadron commanders. As squadrons go, so goes the Air Force. He's lost a lot of those commanders right now, and he's got to get them back. I think once you have the trust of your people and you have a genuine dialogue, they're going to give the ideas about how to fix everything else, and that's the spirit of the Air Force.
Was that because of the post debacle that he lost a lot of the trust, or just the mission to destroy CAS?
It's a little bit of those two issues. I think I do think the post debacle is important for General Welsh because he hasn't spoken about it. We've had this information since last Friday about General Post being reprimanded and fired. We still haven't heard from the Chief of Staff. I think he's got to personally lead the Air Force through that. to show that he understands what it means and to help everybody else understand what it means for the service. But I think it's actually more. It's about a decade-long process now of asking more than the service should ask from people without enough resources, and then doing a little bit of shirking and asking them to do more, and asking them to identify what they can stop doing. The leadership has to come from the top, and I think when he does that, he'll find that airmen have a lot of great ideas about how to make the Air Force solvent, even on a smaller budget.
Lieutenant Colonel retired Tony Carr, I want to thank you very much for joining me this afternoon.
Hey, thanks for having me, James.
We're going to have you on again soon. I think a lot of people really appreciate the experience and the knowledge that you bring to the situation. And we will continue to push. I know something big's coming up next month. We have a few weeks to really get this to locked in, and maybe we'll talk to you before then.
That sounds great.
Ladies and gentlemen, Tony Carr. His blog is John Q. Public. I invite you to look into it. It is an excellent resource of the culture of the Air Force. And he was on today talking about the latest developments with the A-10, General Post, Base Commander Meager, and just the culture in the Air Force and why they were determined to divest the A-10 and the pushback that's happening because of it. You are listening to 104.1 KQTH.
This one goes out